It was the fall of 1862. For more than a year, the Civil War had raged, and the Union Army of the Potomac had known only a series of sharp defeats. Casualties were high, and the means of caring for them tragically inadequate. Hundreds who could have been saved died in the field for lack of proper care. Already a part of history were the battles which we know as Bull Run, the 7 Days, and Jackson's Valley Campaign. Each had been a costly failure for the Union forces, and in the North, people began to wonder if the South could be defeated and the Union preserved. In the most tragic and bitterly punitive fighting our nation has ever known, American fought against American, and the casualty lists for both sides skyrocketed, as on American hills and in American valleys, cannon and musket flung their hot metal among the men and horses of both sides. The spectacle of suffering was piteous, perhaps especially so to Clara Barton, for she decided to do something about it. The already spare face of the man in the White House seemed to grow even more gaunt under a constant flood of criticism and urgent demands for an early end to the war. General Robert E. Lee did not help the situation, as south of the Potomac, he added a measure to the legend of his invincibility by routing a vastly superior Union force at Manassas Junction. General John Pope, who commanded the Union forces at Manassas, was simply out-generaled and outfought by Lee's troops under the immediate leadership of Stonewall Jackson. Flushed with repeated successes and confident of their own destiny, Lee's forces boldly took the offensive. Word was flashed to Washington that the Army of Virginia was invading the North. Speculation and rumor began to whisper that the end of the war was in sight. As the threat to Washington grew, Lincoln sent word to nearby Alexandria, an urgent call to the ex-general-in-chief of the Union Army. General George McClellan had been in disgrace after his Peninsular campaign. Now Lincoln summoned him back. His orders: stop Lee at all costs. Those costs were to be high. On September 17, 1862, Union and Confederate forces would meet at Antietam Creek near the towns of Sharpsburg and Hagerstown, Maryland. More than 100,000 men would be involved in the bloody Battle of Antietam. And one woman, Clara Barton, would carve for herself a unique place in the annals of service to mankind. The day the battle began, however, she was just a dedicated woman, driving a wagon loaded with provisions across the rolling Maryland countryside. Years later, she would recall that day of blood and anguish and retell it in her own words.
With my attendant, I sought the hilltops, and as the mist cleared away and the morning sun broke over the Maryland heights, its rays fell upon the dusty forms of dying men. Many of you may never hear the bugle notes which call men to battle, but if, like us, you had heard them that grim September morning as they rang through the valley and echoed from the 100 hills, they would have lingered in your ears as they do in mine. The battle had commenced on the right, and thinking our place might be there, we had been following the army since dawn. For the last 8 miles, we could trace its course by the broken bodies of the wounded who rested along the roadside. Turning into a cornfield near a house and barn, we stopped in the rear of the last gun. Judging that surgeons must be operating there, I took my arms full of stimulants and bandages and approached the house. The smell of death hung heavy in the yard. A table stood on the porch with a wounded man lying on it, a surgeon working over him with the most rudimentary equipment. There I came face to face with one of the kindest, noblest doctors I have ever known, Dr. Dunn of Knoxville, Pennsylvania. I quickly learned of his difficulties. They had not a bandage, rag, lint, or string, and all around him, shell-wounded men were bleeding to death. With a great joy, I laid my precious burden down among them and thought that never before had linen looked so white. Determined to set up aid in the yard, I told him of my needs, and he dispatched a soldier to help me with the unloading of supplies. There was a spring house in the yard, and I decided to use this as my headquarters. My instructions were to unload the provisions and place them inside for the ordeal that was to follow. We had met wounded men walking or being carried to the rear for the last 2 miles, but around the barn there lay the men who were too badly wounded to admit removal. Some 300 had collected already, and it was scarcely 10 o'clock. The echo of the guns promised there would be many more. My first act on the field taught me the real tragedy of battle. A man called to me for a drink. I stopped to give it, and having raised him in my arms, was holding him. He fell back, dead. A bullet had sped between us, tearing a hole in my sleeve and burying itself in his body. There was no more to be done for him, and I left him to his rest. I have never mended that hole in my sleeve, and I wonder if a soldier ever does mend a bullet hole in his coat. The patient endurance of these men was astonishing. By the wooden fence, a soldier lay with a ball lodged in the bones of his cheek. I told him I would go for the surgeon, but he caught my arm. "They can't come for me now," he said. "I have to wait my turn. Please, you take the ball out for me." This was a new call. I had never severed the nerves and fibers of the human flesh, but I could not withstand his entreaties. Nearby lay a sergeant from Illinois with a bullet directly through both his legs. When he saw that I had no way of supporting the soldier's head, he shoved himself along the ground with a desperate effort and took the wounded man's head in his hands. I do not think a surgeon would have pronounced it a scientific operation. The doctor suffered almost as much as the patient, but from the relief the man had from his pain, I dared to hope it was successful. Three times that day the ground was contested, lost, and won, and each time it brought hundreds of wounded from the field to our crowded ground. Each had to be aided, and each drained our supplies to the danger mark. At 2 o'clock, an attendant came to tell me that the last loaf of bread had been cut and the last cracker pounded. We had 3 boxes of wine still unopened. What should they do? Open the wine and give them that, I said, and God help us. The next instant brought a shout from Sergeant Fields, who had opened the first box. Of 12 boxes of wine which we carried, the first 9 were packed in sawdust. These last 3, when all else was gone, were found to be packed in Indian corn meal. A woman does not hesitate long under such circumstances. There was a fireplace in the spring house. Kettles were picked up and set over the fire, and as quickly as I tell it, I was mixing water and meal for gruel. All the day, my men carried buckets of hot gruel for miles down the line to the wounded and dying where they fell. Food was given both north and south alike, recognizing the need, not the uniform. Never again was I to experience such a sensation of wealth and competency. We fed hundreds that day. For many, it was the first meal since the guns of battle exploded that morning. For many, it provided the will and the strength to endure their pain. Twilight began to descend, and there were still many to be tended. For the first time since I arrived, I saw Dr. Dunn stop work and stand alone in the darkness. "You look tired, Doctor," I said. Yes, he was tired. Tired of neglect and heartlessness. Here were hundreds of men to be operated on, and there was no light to work by. It was then that I called for the lanterns I had brought in the wagons. He looked at me, saying little, but his eyes reflected his gratitude. Through the long starlit night, we worked and hoped and prayed. The lights were never snuffed and the tables were never empty. To some we could promise repair and hope. All we could give to others was a comfortable place to die. Men died that night, slowly and with full realization that life was ebbing out of them. It was to be a northern victory, but the victory was costly for both sides. While the guns grew silent, the sounds of tortured men filled the air as an encore of battle. How does one measure victory? Antietam was a victory for the Union. Her cannon remained on the field while the foe retreated across the river. The high tide of the Confederacy was turned back. The Emancipation Proclamation was born. But to me, the real victory, the real courage of that memorable day was the endurance of all the soldiers to the greatest physical agony and mental anguish, the greatest inhumanity that man can create for man. To them belongs the honor, the memory, the triumph of that day.